The Canadian Beetles arrive.
3, 2, 1,
go! On a snowy day in December the 2nd, 1952, the first Volkswagen Beetles arrive in Canada. Eager car enthusiasts meet them down at the docks in the Toronto Old Harbour downtown. They're moved to the Coliseum building, which is part of the CNE grounds, Canadian National Exhibition, and put on display. Here you can see they're covered in snow, and the date is written on the window. Toronto, Ontario, Canada, written in the snow. What are these funny little cars, people are wondering. In behind them you can see the first VW buses delivered to Canada as well. The Beetles are Zwitter Beetles. These are a unique car built on the oval platform. Volkswagen at the time had leftover split window rear stampings, metal stampings that they wanted to use up, so they incorporated those that they used on the newer Volkswagen Beetles, which were now an oval in Germany, but other markets, lesser markets, got the leftovers, like Canada. The Canadian Beetles were a cheaper Beetle. They deleted a lot of the trim on the outside and around the windows. They had no chrome trim. They didn't have the chrome trim at the bottom running boards either. They had a smaller headliner that covered less space and a cheaper steering wheel as well. Everything about them was a little more basic to keep the cost down for the Canadian market, already pressured by the Deutschmark climbing in Germany. Mechanically, they were the same as the deluxe Beetle that the American market got, except for the deletions in trim that we talked about. They had the new front quarter vent windows, which were a new innovation at the time. Although they were not chrome around the edges, they were painted body colored instead. The price came in around 10% cheaper than the deluxe version. Volkswagen called it the Canadian Custom Beetle, and it was available for $1,730 brand new. They used the castings for the split window until supply was exhausted, and then finally they switched up to the oval window at the back. When the ovals got introduced, they introduced a new model, which was the deluxe model for Canada, pretty much the same as the deluxe Beetle in the USA and other markets, and it was available for $18.95 and was more fancy. Another big difference between them was the custom Beetle and standard Beetle had the 1132cc 30 horsepower engine, while the deluxe Beetle got the 1192cc 36 horsepower engine. This really improved the performance of the Volkswagen Beetle, a 20% difference in horsepower. With the Beetle's rear engine design, it sure got good traction in the Canadian snowy winters, putting power through a 4-speed transmission and independent rear swing axle suspension. The Canadian Volkswagen rear badge was different. People think that it originated in Winnipeg, with the Volkswagen dealers wanting to put a Volkswagen badge at the back of the car, which wasn't included in Germany. So they made one. Here we see Beetles being shipped throughout Canada by train on CN, Canadian National. In the picture, you'll see regular Beetles and Super Beetles. And just to recap the Canadian Beetle hierarchy, at the bottom they had the standard Beetle, then they had the custom Beetle, then they had the deluxe Beetle in the early years. When the Super Beetle was introduced in 1971, they dropped the deluxe Beetle for Canada, and the Super became top of the range. In the USA and other countries, the Super was the only offering. However, in Canada, the Super was the top of the range, as mentioned, and they still made a standard Beetle for Canada, sometimes referred to as the regular Beetle. The custom Beetle was dropped, and the options that the custom had were incorporated into the standard, basically giving it two choices, standard or Super Beetle. It's interesting to note that the Volkswagen Beetles, the standard Beetles, were basically using the swing axle rear transmission all the way to model year 1973. So they used them throughout 73. If you wanted rear IRS, independent rear suspension, with the double jointed CV joint axles, you'd have to go for the Super Beetle. Although they did use the wide swing axle design for 1968 and newer, giving a lot better stability to the rear of the car, greatly increasing stability, which wasn't a problem for the VW as it was with the Corvair. Here you can see how much better the IRS is at the bottom compared to the old swing axle design at the top. Notice how much better tire contact there is for the IRS. Canadian swing axle rear suspensions use the same gearbox ratios in the transmission as the Super Beetle did. So good for highway cruising in Canada. And great gas mileage too. Here you see the ship MS Wilhelm unloading new Beetles in the port of Toronto in 1956. Here, a 1963 Volkswagen Transporter panel van is hoisted down off the ship in Toronto Harbor. Similar activity was happening in Western Canada, with ships arriving to Vancouver full of Volkswagen Beetles, Carmen Gias, and the Type 2 panel vans, all being distributed out of Vancouver Harbor, British Columbia. Tractor trailers from Toronto are shipping Volkswagens to Montreal and points beyond, like Quebec City. By 1959, 100,000 Beetles had been delivered to Canada. The MV Atlantic entered service in 1965 with a capacity of 1,380 passenger cars and began a 5-year charter with Volkswagen. The ship was one of the first purpose-built roll-on and roll-off car carriers, usually delivering her cargo to Canada. She was one of 60 ships that were used to ship Beetles and Volkswagens to Canada. The ship was scrapped in 1985. One can see why the roll-on, roll-off carrier was superior than the old-style ships that had to winch and hoist the Beetles down off the deck onto carriers below, and then on rail, and then some on car carriers driving up and down the 401. Here they're arriving from Vancouver and put on trains heading east and through BC and probably Alberta. They're delivered. Similar activity is happening on the East Coast in Nova Scotia. Well, you can see the deliveries of Beetles all around Canada are taking place back in the day. And here's a 1968 Beetle, a custom Beetle that was brought in. People asked me if there was any manufacturing happening in Canada back in the early years, or was everything just shipped in from other places such as Germany. Being a football fan, I was surprised to find this picture of the Miss Grey Cup beauty pageant standing in front of the facility at Eglinton and Victoria Park in Scarborough. This is the Volkswagen headquarters building, which was very close to the engine remanufacturing plant, also known as the Golden Mile, where Volkswagen had its headquarters for Canada, as well as their stores and parts distribution warehouses. Aside from the engine plant, I couldn't really find any other manufacturing facilities in Canada. Here's a nice picture of the Volkswagen Canadian headquarters at the Golden Mile in Toronto. This was in an east borough of Toronto known as Scarborough. Initially in 52, they set up in Toronto on Yonge Street. They had a small facility. Basically, it looked like a small storefront. I think it was an old toy factory that they occupied. There's an old VW Canada legend that suggests that VW was started by a man in a car with a briefcase driving across Canada, coast to coast, like a traveling salesman, searching for the initial dealers to set up the Volkswagen network in Canada. In fact, there was two men, one Werner Jansen and Kurt Herring. Kurt Herring, the mechanic, Werner, the sales guy. They thought, well, they better not have a problem out in the middle of nowhere in Canada, so they brought the mechanic along. They were a long way from home. They outgrew the little place on Yonge Street and had to expand into the Golden Mile. 10 years later, over 200,000 Canadian Volkswagens were purchased. It was a great Canadian success story, brought to you by the Canadian dealers like Murray Alves, Texaco, and Parry Sound, Ontario. Back in the day. Okay, thanks for watching.